Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first Tech in the City webinar. This series will focus on how people move, plan, and engage in the new urban technology age. Today's guest, Rob Kitchin, will provide a critical assessment of urban data and dashboards. My name is Jerica Logan. I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. If you require closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Click on the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see the subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit any questions at the time during the webinar in the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation, and if we do not get to your question, we apologize. If you have any additional questions following this event, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. This event is approved for 1 AICP CM credit. To claim your CM credits, log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter in the event into your online CM event log. There will also be a brief survey at the end of the webinar, and if you have time, please provide your feedback. I am now going to pass it over to our director, Harvey Miller.
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to today's seminar. This is part of CURA's regular series on issues and challenges facing the cities and regions in Ohio and beyond. Our theme this year is Tech in the City, as Jerica mentioned, and in this series, we're exploring how novel urban data technologies can help us rise to the challenge of an urban planet. We have 3 other events coming up this semester. On October 14th, we'll have Christina Wolf from Newcastle University in the UK. She's a visiting scholar at Ohio State University this fall, and her research focuses on geospatial data infrastructure to make cities more inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And we'll hear about some of that work on October 14th. November 18th, Elizabeth Delmel, who's an associate professor in the Department of City Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania, will be joining us. She'll talk about text as spatial data for urban analytics. And then on December 2nd, we're going to have a panel discussion, and this is going to feature 5 senior members of 3 major planning firms in the US who published a manifesto last year on how to evolve public participation in transportation planning. There is a link to that manifesto on our webpage if you want to check it out. But on December 2nd, we'll talk to the authors about the opportunities and challenges of public engagement in planning. So please visit cura.osu.edu/events to learn about this and other future events. And you can sign up for our monthly newsletter at cura.osu.edu. You can also like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and also on Instagram. That way you'll never miss any of the exciting events or activities that happen at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Rob Kitchin. Rob Kitchin is a professor at Maynooth University Social Science Institute and the Department of Geography, and he's a well-known world-class expert in digital geography, social smart cities, and urban data. His research mostly focuses on those topics. He's the co-author or editor or co-editor of 33 academic books and author of over 200 articles and book chapters, so a very impressive and influential researcher. He was founding and managing editor of Dialogues in Human Geography and Social and Cultural Geography. He was an editor of Progress in Human Geography and co-editor-in-chief of the International Encyclopedia of Human Geography. And as a reward and recognition of his outstanding career, in 2013, he was recipient of the Royal Irish Academy's Gold Medal for the Social Sciences. We're very pleased to have him here today, and I will now turn it over to Rob and we'll listen to what he has to say. Rob, take it away, please.
Thanks. Can you still see my screen? Is it still sharing? It is. Great. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you today. I'll try to stick to the half an hour limit so we have some time for some questions and so on. So yeah, I'm going to talk about telling stories about and with urban data and dashboards, and I'm mostly going to be telling stories about it. And really, the notion of the kind of dashboards really sits within inside of smart cities. It's kind of come along in the last kind of decade at the same time smart cities has, as a kind of I guess a toolkit for making sense of some of the data that's now become available. So often within dashboards, we have kind of, and I'll show you some examples of dashboards in a bit, but we typically have got kind of administrative data, so data from national statistics offices and government departments, semi-state agencies, public bodies, and so on. But they've been joined more recently with what we might call urban big data, which is typically real-time data. So this is data that has a velocity, but it also has exhaustivity. It tends to be at a system scale. So it's not a sample of every car on the road network. It's tracking every single car. It's not tracking particular passengers. It's tracking all passengers and so on. And this kind of big data is now being generated across a whole series of different domains within cities. So within government systems, with feeding into city operating systems, performance management systems, security and emergency services through digital surveillance, coordinated emergency response, and allowing things like predictive policing, into transport with intelligent transport systems, smart travel cards, bike share, feeding out into real-time passenger information, info from smart parking, logistics management, and so on, into energy with smart energy, smart grid, smart meters, into waste, into environment through sensor networks and so on, into buildings, again through kind of sensor networks in buildings, allowing building management systems, into our own homes, where we might have various kinds of smart appliances and so on, and feeding some of that data back out into the civic domain and so on. So we now have this kind of wealth of data, and the question is like how to kind of make sense of some of that. So this is some of the kind of data that we've been playing around with that feeds into some of the dashboards that we've been built, just to give you an idea of some of the kinds of data. So this is real-time mobility data that's available in Dublin, in Ireland, where I'm located. So we have public transit data, so we can track where the vehicles are on the road net, where the buses are, where the trams are, and so on. We have real-time passenger information going out into the bus stops and train stations. We have real-time roadway traversal time, so how long it takes to get along particular road segments. Have inductive loop counters. So these are kind of the tar loops on the road that you drive across, which are kind of counting the cars and counting the time gaps between the cars. Car parking spaces, so how many cars are in the car parks. We have some information around flights, so flight locations, flight arrivals. We have information about the boats in the harbour. Bike share, how many bikes are in the bike stands, how many spaces are free. And some feeds from CCTV cameras. And you can see on the temporal granularity column, that some of this is, it's not fully real time. There's a little bit of latency in some of this data, but it's, a minute, seconds, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, a minute, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and so on. So this is much more temporally fine-grained data than we've typically been used to up until the last kind of decade or so. And that kind of data is feeding into these kind of control rooms. So it's leading to the notion of data-driven urbanism, that we can take this data and use it to manage and govern the city in real time. So this is kind of operational kinds of data. So the most famous of these kind of control rooms, the one that's probably been written about most, is in the top left. It's the control room in Rio. It's a 24/7 control room. It employs 400 people. It's pulling in the data from 32 city agencies and 12 concession companies, which are typically transport or energy companies. And it's kind of tracking all kinds of data in the city, whether that's relating to environment or transport or health or emergency services and so on. It also has a kind of a media room at the back of this. So you have journalists sitting there, and when a traffic accident happens or a landslide happens, they know in real time, and they're writing their stories from within the control room. The bottom left is a traffic control room in Dublin. It's pulling in data from those 800 inductive loops in the road. It's pulling in from 400 cameras, another 100 radar cameras. It's also pulling data off the GPS locations of the public transit. Also pulling in data off of social media, so people tweeting about what's going on with traffic and so on. And it's using that data to phase the traffic lights in real time. So I might come along to a junction and wait 50 seconds to get through. Harvey might come along 5 minutes after me and wait 60 seconds. So depending on the volume of traffic, the phasing is constantly altering. It's not a fixed pattern of phasing. And the person can kind of override that, but generally speaking, it's an automated system. There's a set of algorithms that kind of work that out. The top middle is for a smart district in a suburb in Tokyo, and you can start to see some of the dashboard graphics on that. The bottom is a control room, I think, for a single road. It's the control room for the M25 motorway around London. That's what it takes to keep a big road with lots of other motorways or freeways joining it, kind of moving. And then some of this data kind of has a whole series of various graphical ways of making sense of it and interacting with it. And some of that data then flows back out to the public through these dashboards, or even inside the organizations, you might have specialist dashboards to make sense of the information that then can act on it. Now, a whole series of cities now have created sets of these dashboards and made them publicly available. We built the dashboards for Dublin and for Cork. The first dashboard we built was in 2013 on what was called the Programmable City project. And really what we did was just try to pull together all the data we could find for the city. So this doesn't look like a typical kind of dashboard. The top middle one there looks a bit more like what you would typically see. We pulled in any kind of data that we could find. So administrative data, real-time data, a whole series of mapping data, typically of the things like the census and other kinds of things, a whole lot of planning data, land use, zoning, and so on, planning permissions, a load of location-based kinds of data. You could kind of say, where's the nearest pharmacy to me? Where's the nearest police station? Where's the nearest hospital, doctor, whatever it might be. A load of data about housing, some data some modules where you could upload the data. So you could say, there's a pothole in my area, this is where it is, and so on. And we try to make as much of the data as we could freely available. And there were about 50 modules in there, and there was loads of data. And then we got a new project called Building City Dashboards, where we started to refine that. And we reduced down what we were doing in the dashboard quite significantly. All the data in here had to be open data. It was an open source, open science project. So all the proprietary data disappeared, and we simplified it a lot more. And the project was really about how do you design and build these things, build these dashboards in a way that makes them most usable for the people looking at them, recognizing that there are different types of users. So there are the general public, there are people who maybe have some literacy around data and maybe work in policy and so on. And then there might be a group which you might consider to be power users, who have a lot of knowledge about this, who really want to go and use the data themselves, or to be able to tinker around with our tools rather than just be presented with the data. And we also looked at, like, how can we maybe use the data in different ways, so present the data to the public in different formats. So we started to look at 3D kinds of environments. So we got a model. Well, we produced a model working with the Ordnance Survey here, so the National Mapping Agency. We created a kind of a 7 kilometre by 4 kilometre section of Dublin, working off of the land map and LiDAR scan data. So we were kind of a test partner for a new national 3D data set that will probably be released in a couple of years' time. And we also worked with a surveying company who produced their own 3D model, which is what you can see in the middle here. This actual model has a resolution of 15 centimeters. and it's quite detailed. All the trees are the size of the trees, and so on. They're not generic. They're not generic in that sense. And then we started to look, well, can you feed some of this dashboard data into a model that might be more intuitive for people to understand, as opposed to kind of abstracting it into a 2D map. So the top map here is actually Airbnb data. The height of the dot is how expensive the rental is. I think the red is occupied, the blue is vacant, or whatever. You can click on a dot and it pulls up a panel of information. The middle map here is the real-time bike share stand data. So how many bikes are in the bikes and so on. It is real-time data. This is noise data. The bottom middle is land use zoning, building use data. So building use data. We pushed that into VR, so you could actually kind of walk around it or fly around it. So you can kind of fly around the data if you like. And we also did AR stuff, so mixed reality, augmented reality. So this is a HoloLens, so you can see the real world at the same time as you can see the data. And we did some work with an artist where you could kind of point your phone at a building or at a street, and it would tell you about data along that was in the view. We also did some stuff where we printed out the city model. So this is so in the top left is the whole of that model. It's so it's kind of 7 kilometers long and 4 kilometers, and so it's a 1 to 2000 scale. So this is 3.5 meters by 2 meters. I don't know if you can see at the top is a data projector, and it's projecting the data down onto this 3D printed model. And obviously what's nice about this is you can stand around it and walk around it and have a conversation about it, and you can display different data. So this is the same kind of data. This is Airbnb data at the bottom. In the top is a building classification data. And we could project on the real-time position of the buses, and so you could see them moving along the streets and so on. And you could kind of do, if you like, kind of start to create data stories about people's commute or journey or whatever it might be that you're interested in. Some more recent dashboard work that we've been doing is working with the Central Statistics Office and the Ordnance Survey and the Health Service Executive to do the national COVID dashboard. So the Aero team in the university, which is my kind of former team, kind of built the dashboard for the state. Done very quickly. So the initial dashboard was the idea was pitched on March the 12th, and it was live by March the 24th. And it pulled together all the data across the whole state from all the various hospitals and doctors and health boards and everything else. So you can see on the top left that you've got kind of COVID case data coming in from the kind of incidence trackers. You've got intensive care data, acute hospital data, what's coming out the lab testing, what's going on with vaccinations. The mobile telecoms data was about lockdown and tracking people's movements and so on. And you can see there's quite fine-grained data going on the map down below, and you can click on an area and it would pop out the data to you. So so this is an area of actually only 400 people live in this area, and we can see there are 6 cases. So this is really fine-grained level data. This is at electoral district level data. All of these were interactive. You can kind of zoom backwards and forwards through time. You can alter all the settings and kind of play around with it. The dashboard's been through loads of iterations, and there were 2 versions. There was a version that was done for the public, and then there was a version that was done for 140 senior managers and government ministers who were kind of using it to do their decision making. And you can see the dashboard was the photo at the bottom. The dashboard was you often saw the dashboard in the media coverage. So this is actually the head of the health service executive, the basic person one of the people in charge of doing public policy around the COVID. Quite successful, really, for I think about 250 million views over 2 years from a population of 5 million people. And then we got so if we think about these dashboards, what they're doing is they're kind of a visual means to kind of organize and interact with that data. They're providing a span of control over kind of time series data and data that can move quite quickly in terms of the real-time data. They allow you to kind of get a handle on the characteristics and the structures of the data sets, but would be quite difficult to do if you were to just look at big tables full of numbers. And the power of those data sets is they kind of tell you in real time the state of play of cities. They kind of translate the messiness and complexity of the cities into a form of knowledge that's quite ordered and systematic and relatively easy to make sense of. And part of their claim is that it shows the city as it actually is through data that's objective, it's trustworthy, and it's factual. And part of what we've been doing is looking at those claims and starting to try and think about, kind of telling stories about the dashboards, kind of reflecting on what they're doing and how they're built, how they're designed, the kinds of data that goes into them, how they're actually implemented, how they're used, and how they continue to be used, how they continue to be built, and how they kind of evolve and develop, and so on. Some of that's been quite reflexive through our own work, and some of it's we've actually employed people to do it. So we, for a while, we employed an ethnographer who basically sat in the room at all of the meetings with the stakeholders and with us as researchers, who kind of watched what was kind of going on and how decisions were being made and being negotiated, and all the kinds of the data politics that go on in terms of choice making about what visualization, what data, how things are presented, and so on. And what we've been doing is kind of, I guess, applying a kind of a critical data studies approach onto the data. So, we've been kind of thinking through different issues such as epistemology, the scope and access, the veracity and validity, usability and literacy, issues around use and utility and ethics. And what I'm going to do quite quickly is kind of go through those posed as a kind of set of 6 questions as a way to critically reflect on what we've been doing. And I think they can be a heuristic that you can apply onto anything. So any kind of socio-technical assemblage, you can start to apply this analysis through these kinds of questions. So if we think about epistemology, then the kind of question is, well, how is insight and value derived from these dashboards? So they work off of visual analytics, and they're adopting a realist epistemology, which is a kind of the idea that there's a world that's independent of our ways of making sense of it. So the data are kind of cast as being neutral and value free and essential in nature. So essential in nature basically means that they represent what they're meant to. That there's a direct link, I guess, or corresponding link between what the measure is and the phenomenon that you're measuring. And that's not always the case. So we're often using proxies. So a proxy for innovation might be GDP created, or a proxy for social deprivation might be a whole set of indicators around health, welfare, labor market access, and so on, and you put them into an algorithm, various weights and so on. So that's probably not an essential measure. It's a constructed measure. Typically we're looking for direct measures if we can. And it tries to reveal in some kind of objective way the truth about cities. However, from a critical data studies perspective, that view would be challenged, and we would say that, look, these are not neutral, commonsensical tools. They're a socio-technical assemblage. Lots of choices and decisions were made in terms of how to build them. Everything from what type of sensor, where the sensor is sited. So if you've got noise sensors, where you put the sensor will make a big difference to the type of data that you produce. There's a whole set of politics around that kind of stuff and so on. That these dashboards are things that do work, that they influence decision making and so on. So they're entities that do things. They're not just simply mirrors. They're obviously taking what's a very complicated set of relations and things in the world. So, taking a city and then trying to reduce it down to maybe 50, 60 indicators as a way of viewing what's going on. And they decontextualize the city. So what you get are these graphs. What you don't get is all of the history, the culture, the politics, the governance, and so on, that shapes how that indicator actually works in the real world. You're just presented with the data. And so you decontextualize it from all of that kind of contextual background, which is actually really needed to interpret what's going on. And it gives you the impression that you can kind of run the city off of these datas and levers without knowing any of that kind of stuff. How comprehensive and open are the dashboards? So a whole series of questions around scope and access. So the dashboards are just typically displaying quantitative data, ones that can be measured and tracked over time and space. So enormous amount of information is not in these dashboards. So anything that's not time series data, so one-off survey samples, whatever, that's not in there. All kinds of metaphysical kinds of things, intangible kinds of aspects of everyday life are not in there. So metaphysical aspects are things like values, opinions, beliefs, and so on. The significant gaps and silences in the data that's displayed. There's obviously questions around whether these things are open for view or not. So, there'll be kind of dashboards used within cities that are used by service departments that are not open to the public and they don't see them, and so on. Big differences in the level of openness, and we've had lots of battles trying to get data out of organizations and working with organizations to fix their data practices, to help with their data management, to sort out some of the things they're doing, and then encouraging them to actually open the data for doing that work for them. And when you do get the data, there's often lots of things missing. So you don't necessarily know how it was measured. You don't have the kind of methodological transparency. There's issues around data formats in the media. You often don't have any metadata, issues around data standards, all kinds of things. Then there's kinds of issues around the fracturing of the data and kind of the effects of political geography and political administration. And it can be fractured in a couple of ways. So it can be fractured in relation to geography, and it can be fractured in relation to stakeholders. So you have different scale or organization of data sets. So it could be local, county, regional, state, federal. You can have back-to-back going on between those territories. You can have mismatches between functional territories and administrative geographies. So the footprint of a labor market or a footprint of a retail market, it doesn't match with political administration boundaries. They often flow across. So you kind of create these kind of mismatch problems. And to kind of illustrate that, this is the map in the middle here, top middle is are the kind of towns and cities of Metro Boston. They're all autonomous. So there's 101 like planning departments and GIS departments. There's 101 police departments. There's 101 school districts. There's 101 everything, right? And there's 101 open data sites. In fact, there's not 101 open data sites because loads of them don't have one. The ones that do have them don't necessarily have matching data. So they're using different data ontologies for their 311 data, for example. So it's almost impossible to create a 311 data for the entire metro area. And you can see like you get these weird holes. So the top right is the city of Boston itself. The whole, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the whole here is Brookline, the whole here is Cambridge, the whole here is Somerville, and so on. And they're doing their data analysis as if these places don't exist, but of course they're all part of the same functional territory of the overall metro region. And then you can get fracturing going across the stakeholders. So different public sector organizations, industry, universities, NGOs, community organizations who all have different goals, resources, practices, institutional structures, funding models, ambitions, what they want to do with the data and so on. So actually creating data sets sometimes for cities is really difficult. And often where you find that where smart city stuff is going well is where you have unitary authorities. So places like Barcelona or Amsterdam or Singapore have a single government that goes across the whole of the top of this. Dublin is a little bit like Boston. We have 4 local authorities who are all autonomous, and they all work back to back with no regional body or city body over the top of them. That's the same with Boston. And then there's questions around, can we trust the data? So issues around veracity and validity. So questions around data quality. The data's shaped by a whole load of stuff to do with technical instruments, handling procedures, scientific norms, scientist behavior, all kinds of things. And often the data is published with no metadata. So certainly for most of the data in Dublin, we can't tell you anything about its measurement. We can't tell you much about its sampling, much about how it's been handled, or its veracity, or its uncertainty, or its error, or its bias, or its reliability, or its calibration. You're basically just asked to trust that it's right. Now, we've done a lot of work going through the data sets, and a lot of what we did is actually ring people up or go and meet them and talk through these kind of things so that we could assess what was going on. And when we do that, and we kind of think through some of the kinds of things, so we've got stuff here about reliability, like, is this data set going to be available in 5 years' time? Transparency, privacy, fidelity, cleanliness, completeness, coherence, metadata availability, standardization, methodological transparency. We know what's kind of how it's been collected. If we go back to our real-time travel data, there isn't a single one that's got good all the way across. There's some that's nearly there, but some have got fair, some have got not ready, and not ready actually means we don't know. So there's real kinds of questions around some of the data, because this data might be being used to make quite consequential policy decisions or operational decisions. And then there are issues around, the interpretation of that data. So you can have these kind of modifiable aerial unit problems. So this is exactly the same data displayed at 3 different scales. This is electoral district to numerator area and small area. This is 3 to 4,000 households. This is 3 to 400 households. And this is 80 to 100 households. And this area at the bottom, which is the bright red, is over 45% unemployment. This area looks like it's in trouble until you get down to small area. And lo and behold, it's actually got less than 5% unemployment. If you were doing area targeted initiatives, you'd put money and resources into this area, unless you map it at this scale and you realize it's actually not a problem. And it's actually this red strip here that's really the problem in that area. Loads of issues around literacy. And what we found in our studies is, and why we moved away from our original dashboard, is the level of data literacy amongst the public is actually quite low. And their ability to be able to interpret these dashboards, particularly when you're using some of these quite complicated visualizations, as shown in this kind of graph at the bottom, is difficult. And we redesigned our dashboards into different ways, and we kind of moved to stories for the public, where you had some kind of narrative that interpreted what was going on, and then we had tools and we had tasks, and you could where you could kind of maybe alter the algorithm yourself, and so on. So we tried to kind of think through how different users might engage with some of this data. Loads of politics about how the data is used. So how is this actually used? So in some cities, as you know, in the US, like Baltimore, running its city stat, they have weekly dashboard meetings. You have the heads of the various service agencies come in. They're shown their data from the previous week, and they're asked, why did you only fill in 89% of the potholes? Why haven't you filled in the 11%? What are you going to do about it next week? And so on. So they're using the data to kind of track what's happening in the city at a very operational kinds of level. In other places, you'll use it contextually. It's just part of data that feeds into policy, along with a whole series of other kinds of data and so on. So you can use this data kind of tactically, you can use it symbolically in terms of like place promotion and so on. You can use it politically to try and support particular political positions and so on. You know, and so on. So the top one is city score from Boston, and you see it's tracking the data daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly. If you're still in red after a quarter, your department gets a visit from the mayor, and you're asked to explain what's going on and why you're failing to meet your targets. So this is data that's feeding into performance management, as opposed to maybe more contextual policy use of data, which is how it's used in Dublin. That we don't use the data operationally in this sense, in this kind of business intelligence way, KPI way of running a city. And then loads of issues around ethics, which I'm kind of going to skip over really, but there's questions here around privacy, around some of the data, around ownership and control, and whether it goes off into data markets, how the data is maybe used to socially sort or redline, or to into marketing and selling things. So making decisions about who gets what, which areas get what, and so on. Into predictive profiling or anticipated governance, so things like predictive policing. Into nudge and how people are encouraged to maybe act in certain ways. Questions around data security. Issues around control creep, which is data designed for one purpose being used for another. I'll skip that one and just talk about the latest project. So that's the kind of work we've done up until now. And what I'm doing now is just starting a new project called Data Stories, which is really going to focus on this kind of telling stories about and telling stories with data, focusing in particular on planning and property data. So there's myself, there's a creative technologist, there's a kind of a lecturer, so assistant professor, who's also half-time working on the research, 3 postdocs, and it also will employ 2 creative writers and 2 artists. And in phase 1, what we're going to do is try and map out the entire data ecosystem across state, business, and NGOs. So who is collecting what data, whether it's housing data or commercial business data, you know, whether it's to do with planning, whether it's to do with real estate, whatever it might be, and have a look inside those organizations as to what they're collecting. So say within the Department of Housing, there's data on housing, there's data on homelessness, on planning, on population projections, on land use, on infrastructure, on construction, on unfinished housing, vacant housing, dereliction, and so on. And then there are all these data sets. And what we're trying to do is do a forensic down at the level of individual variables, what is actually collected for the city across everything, which we don't know at the minute. There's no city on the planet really who really knows to any great degree. The data ecosystem is quite fragmented and fractured and quite partial in visibility and so on. And then we're going to work with 12 of those stakeholders to kind of do more in-depth work with them over 6 months. So we're going to do kind of interviews with them, walk through observation. So as they enter the data into the system, as they try to do some of their data analytics and so on, so kind of ethnographies. And then we're also kind of going to run these workshops with the stakeholders, working with the writers and the artists to look at creating stories either about their data or creating stories with their data. So creating a story about homelessness from their data and so on. And so within each one of those case studies, we'll have 3 data stories, one produced by us, so myself and the creative technologist, one produced by the writer and artist working on their own, and then one created by the stakeholder team working with my team. So we kind of get, overall, we'll have kind of 36 of these stories, which will hopefully give us a good idea about all of the kind of the data politics, all the kinds of things I've been talking about, the kind of critical data studies approach onto these kinds of projects. But it's also a way to try and help these organizations think about what it is that they're actually doing, what data are they generating, what data are they not generating that they might be, are they sharing the data with the right people, are they extracting as much value and as use out of the data as they could be, and so on. And I'm aware of the time, so I'll end there.
Okay, thank you. was expecting a big flourish at the end, but sorry, I wasn't ready. But
No.
but thank you. I've taken so many notes and wrote down a lot of questions. Let me know where to begin. But before I begin, I want to encourage the audience to go ahead and enter questions into the Q&A, and we'll get to them at some point during the discussion. And the first question is, yes, I'll answer this question right now, is that the link will be online at Kira. We'll be posting a recording of this at our website. So I find it really interesting, Rob, that you seem to, in one sense, you're very engaged with urban data and urban dashboards. At the same time, you're very critical, and you have a very critical eye towards this.
Yeah.
And I know that from your published work as well.
Yeah.
Can you tell us your journey to how you got here in engaging with urban data and urban dashboards, and how your views have evolved over time?
Yeah, I can. I mean, just on that point, your first bit of it, yeah. I mean, I build it to destroy it, to build it better is the idea. So we build it and critique the hell out of it, basically. That's the idea. By asking the critical questions, you can start to think about how you would actually build a more effective product, if you like. So that's kind of what we're doing. But yeah, no, I've been looking at kind of society, technology kind of relationship for a long time, going back into the 1990s. So I think the first paper I wrote about the internet was 95, I think. My first book on cyberspace was 98. So really looking at the internet, and then doing a lot of work with Martin Dodge around software and the embedding of software into everyday life, and then moving on to data and thinking about, because data is the other half of the software thing. And but my background is like GIS. So, I have a master's in GIS. I was doing quant geography and discovered critical social theory, I guess. And so, yeah, kind of ideas around critical GIS, radical statistics, those kinds of ideas. So rather than rejecting this kind of work, I'm more kind of interested in how can you do it in ways where you're cognizant of the politics within it and making those politics clear, as opposed to denying they're there or trying to hide them. So that's what we're trying to do, is kind of reveal the ways that these kinds of things produce knowledge and influence how action actually takes place. So yeah, that's what I've been trying to do, really.
So what do you think at this point? I mean, can you give us examples of where urban dashboards have actually led to positive or negative policy or investments in cities? I mean, what's a success story? What's a cautionary tale? Can you share some of that?
Yeah, I mean, they're used. I mean, as I said, they're used in different ways in different places. So in some of the US cities, they are used in a very kind of operational kind of way, where you are reviewing the data quite regularly, and it's very performance management, and it is like trying to run the city like you'd run a business in terms of like the KPI and so on. Whereas in European cities, they're much more cautious about doing that. And they would see the data as part of a wider set of data and a wider set of analysis. So you're still doing, the data is just feeding into a whole set of other kinds of data, which might involve qualitative data and doing focus groups and doing surveys and going off and talking to people and doing whatever. And a recognition that some of the timeframes don't work, right? So, typically education policy is a 20, 30 year policy. You're trying to change how young kids exit at university so it's over a long period of time. Measuring that on a weekly basis and trying to alter the data levers is kind of crazy. Like you have to kind of recognize that some policy is actually really long term, and you're not going to see short term changes because it's going to take a gradual effect. So they'd be more conscious about trying to alter their policy based on a kind of a mismatch of the timing. But yeah, I mean, like obviously the COVID dashboard I know it's not the city dashboard, but the COVID dashboard is a very clear example where national policy was being driven off of that, like decisions taken to lock down the country and limit people to no more than a kilometre from there was made based on that data. So, you know, and the data was feeding off into the modelling that the modelling team was doing, and that modelling team included geographers, right? So people like Chris Brunsden was on the national modelling team around COVID, and obviously the Aero were doing all the dashboards and all the data and so on. So really quite consequential decisions. They're now doing the dashboard for the national planning framework, and they were doing it before the national planning framework was done. So I don't know what that is. Maybe 40 billion euros of infrastructure spends is based on the data within the dashboards. So that's quite significant, I would think. Mm-hmm. You know, so yeah, some quite big decisions could be made based on how people are presented with the data and how they interpret it.
Right, and you anticipate a couple other questions I had. One is, how do we ensure all this data and urban data technologies and smart technologies don't reinforce existing power differentials or even make them worse? It seems to me that's a real danger with some of these data dashboards.
Yes, that would be like one of the real critiques of things like predictive policing. And actually why some cities are pulled away from predictive policing is because they're effectively racial profiling. So if you're building your model based on past data and your past data is full of institutional racism, then you basically teach the algorithm to target particular groups that you've targeted unfairly previously, and it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. And the same kind of thing will go into credit ratings, into redlining around mortgages, into people's access to tenancy or loans, and so on, and the same into where you're going to disinvest from. And there's quite a nice paper a couple of years ago by I think it's Safransky on kind of algorithmic stuff around real estate in the US, places like Detroit, where decisions about disinvestment were taken by algorithms basically, and they just reinforced existing social exclusions. So yeah, there are some real issues around what data you use for that, because there's some nice books again around who's counted and who's uncounted. So there's a lot more data about poor people than there is about rich people, because poor people end up in lots of different systems, in welfare systems and housing systems, in whatever, right? And and so you can kind of get these systematic biases within the kind of the data ecosystem, if you like, that then can have these kind of consequential decisions as to who gets what, and who's kind of ignored and so on.
Well, that's kind of interesting, because I would have thought there'd be a bias towards rich people in some of these data dashboards, but you're suggesting that because of the interactions between poor and different institutional and organizations, that there may be a bias towards poor, if we can use that word bias.
Well, it's a bias towards both. One is getting more resources and one is getting less resources. So, and it's about, you can get bias on different things, right? So, the classic example that people have kind of talked about in the literature is the street bump app in Boston, where it was working off of the sensor in your phone. And so if your car if you're driving along and your phone kind of juddered, it tried to work out if that was a pothole or what might have caused the phone to judder, But, typically it's richer people who have phones with whatever and are uploading the data into whatever system. So basically it targeted the pothole repair teams to the richer parts of to the well-off neighborhoods as opposed to the poorer neighborhoods. So, it's just, and there's a bunch of different examples around that kind of stuff. And, there's a whole load of debates going on at the minute around facial recognition cameras and how they're kind of working and target different groups and how they're configured to, and so on, which is now being built into different, there's like 25,000 cameras in New York have facial recognition linked onto them, right? So same in Chicago, and other kinds of cities.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Jerica Logan, who's going to field a couple of the questions we've received from the audience. Jerica, please.
Yeah.
So our first question says, regarding the predictive policing, I completely agree. Do you think it's more a matter of interpretation and analysis than actual data? For example, if we argued for resource allocation rather than more police, could that be helpful to communities?
Yeah, so yeah, the predictive, I mean, there's a lot of kind of started to be written about the predictive policing. I mean, there's been a lot of investment into this, right? So you now have these kind of new command and control centers. They're pulling in data from lots of different things. It's not just predictive policing. It's like the data ecosystem around that, whether that's shot spotter, whether that's encouraging kind of neighborhood watch kind of schemes where the community itself reports crime back up into the system, whether it's camera networks, whether it's sensor networks, whether it's body cams on police, whatever it might be. And then the other side of the data is obviously the algorithms, and a lot of this is automated management, really. So automation tends to work at three levels. You have human on the loop, human in the loop, and human off the loop. Human on the loop basically is the algorithm flags up something, but it's always a person who makes a decision based on what's flagged up. The human in the loop is the system will make it automatic decisions, but somebody can step in and make an alter it. So that's what's happening in a traffic control room. All those traffic lights are being phased automatically, but a controller can intervene and say, actually, I'm going to alter the phasing for this particular junction for this particular reason. And then off the loop is you just let it run, and it makes the decisions automatically, and so on. Now, if you can think about that in relation to predictive policing, the third level is quite problematic, right? And the second level might still be quite problematic if you're just going to let it run. So and which is typically how they've been working, right? So they're throwing up decisions that then make decisions about who's going to, what teams are going to patrol where, and where they're going to target their resources, and so on. And really what you'd want is the bottom one, which is on the loop, where the person interpreting the data has also got some contextual information about the history of what's gone on in those areas, about how the policing has been done and whether it's worked or not worked, and so on. There's a more contextual reading of what happens with the data. So it partly depends on the degree to which you want people involved in the data interpretation, or the extent to which you're happy to leave it to the algorithm based on whatever data you've got going in. The issue, as I've already said, is if you've got kind of institutional long-term bias already in the data, and that's your training data set, then you reproduce all kinds of things that you really want to get rid of. And that kind of data is going on all across the law system, particularly in the US. So, in some places now, your sentencing is done by an algorithm. In some places, you have the choice about whether you want the judge to sentence you, depending on whether you think they're a lenient judge or not lenient judge, or whether you want the algorithm to censor you, to give you your sentence, or you just want the judge to do it, and so on. So there's a lot of playing going on with AI in that kind of space that raises loads of ethical questions, both in relation to the data and the algorithms and how they're configured. And weightings make a big difference. So we've done quite a bit of work around social deprivation indices, and you only have to tweak the weightings in algorithms marginally to get completely different rankings of places. So the reason why it matters is because the bottom 20% of places are getting 90% of the investment into targeted area initiatives to combat social deprivation. So if you're one of those areas and somebody tweaks the algorithm and you pop out of the bottom 20%, you're going to be really annoyed with me. And it really is marginal alterations can make quite big, significant differences.
Great, thank you for that. So our next question is, what do you make of public hackathons as a means to the possibility for better dashboard building built by actual users? This approach is applied partially in Taiwan, for example. Maybe they're widely used everywhere else.
Yeah, they're used all over the place. I mean, we did field work in Boston for a couple of months, and we went to several of them, organized by different organizations, and you'll find them across cities all over the place. I think they've been dropping out of popularity. We do actually have a couple of papers on hackathons and critiquing them, so you can look those papers up and see what our critique of them is. Basically, the big problem with them is the people taking part have no domain knowledge. And by that, I mean, they don't know anything about cities other than their own personal experience. They don't necessarily know anything about the history or the governance or the policy or the politics or, what has been tried or not been tried over the past 20 years or 30 years. And they produce apps that are quite benign. There's a reason why 99% of hackathon apps don't get past version 0.1. It's because somebody else has already tried it and succeeded, or tried it and failed, and there's no business model for it. And there were a nice idea about trying to collectivize people's kind of creativity and their own personal knowledge and bring it together to kind of solve problems. But if you don't have the deep domain knowledge in the room, so you really need to organize a hackathon between an organization. Like you would need the urban service department, a service department within the municipality, or you'd need people who actually have the expertise of doing that and have deep knowledge from trying to do it over 20 or 30 years, as opposed to somebody who's just like a really good coder, but that's it really. So that's been the problem with hackathons in Taiwan. They do run them quite differently, and they have a kind of a different kind of ethos and setup around how they're running them, and they do try to get that domain knowledge in the room doing that. And that's because like the person running the kind of cultural, the minister for cultural and digital whatever was a hacker, and he comes from that space, and he knows about kind of citizen science and participatory approaches onto developing this stuff, and so they've approached things quite differently. So yeah, again, it differs in different places because of the context of how they're kind of organized. I mean, the ones that were produced in Dublin are the ones we went to. I mean, all the stuff was, not, I mean, it was good for the people in there, and they got to network and they got to meet people from these companies and they got to meet other people and so on. But what they produced was, not great.
What you were looking for the word there.
Yeah, it wasn't going to fix the city, put it that way.
Mm-hmm. We only have a couple minutes left, but I do have a big question. It's a follow-up from what you just said, and also what you've been saying. You keep mentioning the importance of context, and you also mention that you need some expertise. How do you balance those two? Because I understand like the professionals running the cities know what's been tried, they know the science, they know the practice, but then you have the lives of the people who actually live in the neighborhoods, especially vulnerable neighborhoods. Yeah. How do you reconcile those different streams of evidence and expertise?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a big question, and the planning profession has been, and planning academia stuff has been thinking about this for a long time. I think thinking about participatory planning, participatory GIS, citizen science, everything from town hall meetings to smartphone apps and whatever else, right? So there's a whole bunch of ways in which people try to engage with communities to get ideas and so on. I mean, there are issues with it, right? Because certain groups have more capacity to engage, certain groups have more resources to engage, some of them have more political power and networks to leverage, and so on. So participatory planning doesn't always work in quite the way that people anticipated. There's some nice papers, I think, by Strappenberg Frick, where she talks about the push to move towards participatory planning, which was seen as being this kind of very progressive, emancipatory, empowering kind of action. But in the places that she was looking, it actually been captured by the Tea Party and very right-wing exclusionary interests. You know, there's this notion of if it goes to the public, it will be, this progressive social justice kind of view. But of course, the public is full of diverse sets of people, right? Can easily be captured by those people who support Trump as those people who support Biden, right? You know, or various other political shades. So it's always fraught with those difficulties. And, you know, planners are meant to be the kind of level-headed, neutral, kind of utilitarian, greatest good for the greatest number kind of role, and they have to negotiate that politics, which can quite quickly get corrupted. So yeah, it's quite difficult, I think, to balance those kinds of things, but it's how you doing things without any kind of consultation, particularly on big decisions about what's going on in neighborhoods or big infrastructure investment. Yeah, it does need some engagement. It's just how to do that. You know, and I think it is useful to do it with evidence, to try and make it evidence informed and not for it to be off of anecdote and kind of clientelist pork barrel kind of politics, that you've actually got an evidence base in which you can kind of talk through, you know, what's happened over a period of time and what's likely to happen. So scenario building, future orientated projection or backcasting or whatever it might be.
Well, I could continue on for another hour or so, as I'm sure you can, but we're out of time right now. So thank you very much, Rob. That was a very illuminating and I think a lot of food for thought there about urban data and dashboards, and good luck on this big project you have. I'm looking forward to seeing the results from it.
Yeah, and I am as well.
And everyone else, join us again for the series Tech in the City. Our next speaker will be October 14th, Christina Wolf from Newcastle University. Have a good day, enjoy your weekend, and as always, be safe and take care. Bye, everyone.
That's great. Thanks, Harvey.
Bye.